This feels like a really big story to me. It's not exactly clear why Vladimir Putin's more interesting than this. This just seems like a story that we should be covering much more than we do. This seems potentially like one of the biggest stories of my lifetime,
No, Mr. Carlson, this is not one of the biggest stories of your lifetime. This is the biggest story of human history. All of human history. The reason that UFOs are the biggest story of all of human history is not because they are cool or fantastic or incredibly interesting. It's because of the implications of their existence. Those implications are predicated on 4 core hypotheses of exactly what UFOs are. The most common hypothesis is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which states that all of the unexplained craft and drones are the provenance of off-world civilizations in our universe. Second favorite hypothesis of what these are is the interdimensional hypothesis, which states that these objects originate from another dimension and cross over into our own. Another really interesting hypothesis, which happens to be Hal Puthoff's favorite hypothesis, is the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which states that these anomalous objects are all coming from an evolved hominin that broke off from the human race a long time ago. These evolved hominins saw the warlike predilections of humanity and didn't want to have to contend with that, so they retreated underground and have used their advanced technology to shield themselves from human detection. And the fourth hypothesis, which I think is the most unlikely of them all, is that a nation state in our world somehow had a physics and science breakthrough in which their technology jumped by thousands of years compared to the rest of the world, and UFO sightings are a result of this nation state visiting different quadrants of the world with their breakthrough technologies. If any of those hypotheses are true, that leaves open profound transformation for all elements of our world, including plant, animal, and human elements. As a planet, we could discard fossil fuel and harness clean forms of energy that have no limits and do not run out. Finally, we could have manned and unmanned missions to all of the planets and moons in our solar system. And it would take anywhere from minutes to hours to get to those locations. But beyond that, it's quite possible with this advanced type of technology, we could go beyond our solar system and visit planets and moons that are even light years away. But what if the hypotheses of 1, 2, and 3 are all true? That is, some of these UFOs are of extraterrestrial origin, some are of interdimensional origin, and some are of ultra-terrestrial origin. Could you imagine if we came into that knowledge in the near future, the paradigm shift that would have upon our planet? Quite frankly, if we came into that knowledge, the Earth we would have with that knowledge would look nothing like the Earth we have currently. That new knowledge would incalculably impact every nook and cranny and component of human culture and society. It would impact religion, academia, science, culture, music, movies, mental thoughts, behaviors, reflections, your own imagination. That is why I call this shift wind. That's why that's my favorite metaphor, because when we do come into this new knowledge, which is inevitable, because we will someday learn what the origin of UFOs are, that will be the shift. And it will impact everything just like the wind. When you look at the wind, it impacts everything in its wake. Even if there is a window, if the wind blows hard enough and long enough, it will eventually give way, and everything within that structure will be turned upside down. Sadly, there are myriads upon myriads of pseudo-skeptics in this world who have missed the most profound and important story in human history, and they missed it for no other reason than confirmation bias and being susceptible to government propaganda. And that's a sad thing. And I believe they know they're on their last leg. This is their last hurrah, and I believe deep down they know that. and they feel deeply threatened right now, and you can see it. I've been reading articles, I've been interacting with pseudo-skeptics on Twitter, and it's like somewhere deep within the recesses of their being, of their mind, they're like, oh shit, ATIP, gun camera footage, many witnesses coming forward, congressmen and women saying this is all real. Oh shit, and they're doubling down right now. And it's one of the most pathetic scenes I've ever seen. But it's very sad, because instead of investigating this and trying to figure out what it is, all they're doing is harnessing their intellect to come up with alternative explanations for corroborated UFO events that have ample evidence to support them. And these alternative explanations amount to nothing but pure and unadulterated desperation. And there's endless examples of that, and I'll be sharing some of those with you. Here's a run-in I had with one of these pseudo-skeptics. His name is Mick Bird West. Skeptics, debunkers can't reasonably have it both ways. If UFOs end up being a complete fraud, I will unhesitatingly admit that I failed at assessing the available data. But will skeptics do the same if UFOs end up being unequivocally real? If not, then they are just dishonest. Mick responds, and there's always going to be UFOs, simply because it's impossible to conclusively identify everything. The existence of exotic technologies or alien is not falsifiable. Their non-existence is falsifiable. I.e., you can't prove something doesn't exist, but you can prove it does. I'm sure you could formulate a scenario in which UFOs were proven to be technology. If that scenario unfolded, would you admit you miscalculated on the historicity of the UFO phenomenon? Mick responds, new evidence arriving does not mean that the old evidence was good evidence. If my calculations were wrong, then I'd admit that. If my calculations were wrong because of incomplete information, then I'd admit that. I'm all about the facts. My only concern is that if UFOs are ever proven real to the extent debunkers demand, they will say, quote, I was responsible for denying them for all these years, and I waited until more evidence came in. I will not buy this at all. You can always have more evidence. That's not the question. The real and honest question is whether there was enough data prior to the quote-unquote smoking gun to take UFOs seriously. That's rather subjective. If UFOs are proven, then we'd have vastly more interesting things to talk about. While I agree with Mick West that there will be vastly more interesting things to talk about in a post-disclosure world, I disagree with his assertion that we can't objectively determine whether or not brilliant minds prior to disclosure had the requisite data available to them to take UFOs seriously. No, that's not subjective, nor will the scholars and the scientists and the psychologists deem it so in the post-disclosure era. Furthermore, it's incumbent upon society to research and learn exactly how governments of the world created such powerful propaganda that people like Joe Nickell and Neil deGrasse Tyson and Mick West fell for it hook, line, and sinker. We certainly do not want to repeat that mistake, and therefore we must study how exactly it occurred. Here's a great quote from Richard Dolan's book, AD After Disclosure. There will also be a resurgence in the study of the phenomenon of social control. What is it about the human brain that enabled billions of human beings, from the slow-witted to the brilliant, to become duped by a propaganda system of UFO denial? Why could they not see that the Emperor was indeed wearing nothing at all? The reason I call Mick West Mick Bird West is because on March 9th, gun camera footage was published that was released by the Department of Defense. And Mick West, one of Mick West's hypotheses is that what was featured in that gun camera footage was a bird. To believe this, you have to conclude that the military pilots were duped by a bird, and so were all the investigators and military experts that studied the gun camera footage.
Nickell 6-1 Tango Project.
Oh, got it! Woohoo!
Roger. There's troubleshooting as soon as I get
You got to it, no, it's not. Okay.
One of the last things I want to do in this video is respond to an article by Joe Nickell titled Navy pilot's 2004 UFO, a comedy of errors. But to be quite frank, the only comedy of errors that I'm getting are the multitudes of them that I found in your article, Mr. Nickell. Mr. Nickell writes, but as Fravor descended, the object ascended toward him. He said, quote, we were at least 40 miles away, and in less than a minute, this thing was already at our cap point, end quote. Yet, something is wrong in the information here. How could someone see what a 40-foot object was doing from 40 miles away? Now, this is totally bizarre. If you're curious, Mr. Nickell, as why I do not extend the requisite respect towards you to call you a skeptic, and I insist on calling you a pseudo-skeptic, this would be one of those prime examples, sir. By examining the sentence that Mr. Nickell quoted and going up a mere 3 sentences and reading it all together, it becomes glaringly obvious that at this point in the encounter, Commander Fravor was not in visual contact with the object, and the only way he discovered that the object went to his cap point 40 miles away is when the radio operator on the USS Princeton relayed that information to him via his radar system. I'll read the 3 preceding sentences of the sentence Mr. Nickell quoted so that you can see what I'm talking about. The 2 fighter jets then conferred with the operations officer on the Princeton and were told to head to a rendezvous point 60 miles away called the cap point in aviation parlance. They were en route and closing in when the Princeton radioed again. Radar had again picked up the strange aircraft. Sir, you won't believe it, the radio operator said, but that thing is at your cap point. We were at least 40 miles away, and in less than a minute, this thing was already at our cap point, Commander Fravor, who has since retired from the Navy, said in the interview. So as you can see from the article, there is absolutely no indication that Commander Fravor saw the object 40 miles away with his eyes, but instead, the operator on the USS Princeton radioed Commander Fravor to let him know that it was 40 miles away at his cap point. But beyond the correct interpretation being crystal clear in the New York Times article, David Fravor has clarified this point over and over again in many separate interviews. So this begs the question, is Mr. Nickell acting in good faith when he's investigating the Nimitz event? Or alternatively, is he just trying to poke holes wherever he can, even when there's no holes to poke? I will let you, the audience, make that determination. Mr. Nickell writes, interestingly, before the planes were sent to the site, the controller had made sure they were not weaponized. What prominently stands out in my mind when David Fravor talks about this point in the story is that he often states the following: this is real world tasking. He makes it crystal clear, which indicates that this was not some kind of drill or some kind of practice mission, that this was for real. So how Mr. Nickell interprets this as the controller hoping that he did not have any ordinances is beyond me. There are many more significant problems found within Joe Nickell's article that are just as problematic, if not even more problematic than the ones I shared with you. The impression that I get from Joe Nickell's article is that his sole motivation in writing it was to induce doubt in people's minds regarding the Nimitz event, in contrast with trying to figure out what's actually going on, which is why I find his article to be such an affront to objectivity and rationality. If you want to read Mr. Nickell's Comedy of Errors article, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. I will leave you with one quote, which will be my contributions to the studies that will emerge in a post-disclosure world on how people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Joe Nickell, and Mick West failed to see the truth of our reality when there was so much multifaceted data available to them to enable them to see the truth of our reality. People make mistakes and get things wrong, but even scientifically, this reality has limits. Pseudo-skeptics would have you believe there are no limits here. This is partly why they failed in seeing the reality of our universe. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you'd like to support this channel, you could check out my merch shop, link in the description, or you can even become a patron, or you can just slap a like on this bad boy, and I'll really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.